Okay, great news. You are on the final 9 weeks. The last 9 weeks we're going to be focusing on our last unit of study. In this case, it's going to be astronomy. Astronomy is a great topic to end the school year with. There's lots of interesting things to look at and study. Lots of different activities and stuff that go with this as well. Alright, so we're starting off with some information that actually isn't in the textbook, so you definitely want to make sure that you take really good notes with this. Obviously, like other assignments, this is turned in for a grade. You can see we're going to talk about space exploration in general, kind of the history of NASA. Alright, so first slide then. What exactly is a satellite? A satellite is any object that revolves around another object. So of course, nowadays we have artificial satellites. We have communication satellites, we have weather satellites. Maybe you have Dish Network or Direct TV at home. So literally your TV signal comes from a satellite. Cell phone signals can bounce off satellites, to cover the great distances between cell towers. So your life in everyday shape or form in some way is probably affected by artificial satellites. Of course, there are natural satellites as well. The moon going around the Earth is a natural satellite. The Earth, as it revolves around the sun, that's a natural satellite. Alright, the history of the space race really began with this guy. It was called Sputnik 1. Sputnik 1 was the world's first artificial satellite. It was actually launched by the Soviet Union, which was Russia's part of it. This goes back more towards the Cold War, though, and what the Cold War was, so if you know any history about the Cold War. But basically, when the Soviet Union put this satellite in orbit, as an American, you could go outside and you couldn't see it above your head, but if you turned your radio dial to the right frequency, you could hear this beep, 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 the signal that the satellite put off. And really, that signal put fear into Americans, because if the Soviets could put a communication satellite above their head, what would stop them from putting a nuclear bomb right above the United States and dropping on us? So this really began the space race. Which country could outdo the other country in the space race? And I'm going to talk about that more in a couple slides, not the next one though. The next one is space probes. Space probes are instruments that basically gather and send information back to the Earth. So in other words, space probes don't usually orbit around something. They are sent to somewhere. So for instance, Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 were sent out to study the outer planets, Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, Neptune. Pioneer was actually the first probe that was ever launched by the United States to go and study Jupiter. Galileo is a more recent probe that went and studied Jupiter. The Viking probes actually landed on and got the first pictures from Mars' surface. Mars is probably the most studied planet. It has the most amount of probes that have been sent there. Literally, there are robotic explorers, Spirit and Opportunity, Pathfinder, that are roving around on the surface of Mars, taking readings, getting pictures, sending information back to the Earth. So that's what a space probe is. All right, as far as space programs then, what we're going to kind of talk about then is the history of NASA. Once the Soviets launched Sputnik, obviously America knew that they were behind. So of course the next goal was, okay, who could get a person into space? Well, unfortunately the Soviet Union beat us again. A guy named Yuri Gagarin was actually the first person put into space. So the United States was trailing for many, many years in the space race. The ultimate goal then became going to the moon. Could we get to the moon before the Soviet Union? Well, the first step in that process was called Project Mercury. Project Mercury had a couple goals. Its first goal was to orbit a crewed spacecraft and return it to Earth. So in other words, get a single person into orbit and return him safely back to the Earth. That was the second goal. Of course, that had never been done before. It seemed like such a duh statement, we'll bring him home safely, but if you've never done it before, that can be quite dangerous. Remember, coming back through the Earth's atmosphere protects us from meteors and other objects from space. It doesn't allow things to pass through it very easily, including spaceships. So could we design a spaceship that could withstand the heat of re-entry? Well, that was all about Project Mercury. There were actually 7 Mercury flights. and all 7 of them were very successful. Those first 7 astronauts became like national heroes. They were like rock stars, very famous people. The last slide actually goes over some of the more famous astronauts. The next step in the project then became Project Gemini. If you were going to go to the moon, this was kind of the in-between step. The first goal was to launch a 2-person spacecraft. The spacecraft they used was called a Titan rocket. This is actually a picture of the Titan rocket here, kind of a cartoon version. The second goal then became to connect 2 spacecrafts in space. They realized that they were to go to the moon. Instead of building one super huge rocket that could lift off the surface of the Earth, go to the moon, land on the moon, blast off the moon, blast back to the Earth, land on the Earth, that would take a huge amount of fuel. They realized early on that it would take 2 spaceships then. A much smaller spaceship that would actually only land on the surface of the moon and get back off the surface of the moon. It was called a LEM, or Lunar Excursion Module. So could they attach 2 spacecrafts together in space while orbiting around the Earth, orbiting around the moon? That really became the goals of Project Gemini. So they practiced this over and over and over. There were, I think, 12 successful Gemini flights. All right, with the success of Project Gemini then, they were ready to move on to Project Apollo. The first goal was to launch a 3-person spacecraft. And obviously the ultimate goal was to land on the moon and return safely. The first successful mission to do that was obviously Apollo 11. There were other moon landings. There were actually 6 other moon landings. So in the history of mankind, there have only ever been 12 lucky guys, 12 lucky individuals that have got to walk around on the surface of the moon. Some of the more famous astronauts that are out there then. Here's a list of the few. The first person in space was Yuri Gagarin. Again, he was a Soviet cosmonaut. That's what they called their astronauts. First American in space was called Alan Shepard. He went up aboard a Mercury Redstone rocket, a short 15-minute little flights, but technically he was into outer space. John Glenn then was actually the first American to actually orbit around the Earth, and he orbited around the Earth 3 times. Neil Armstrong, of course, is the very famous astronaut. He was the first person to get to walk on the moon. Very famous words, that's 1 small step for man, 1 giant leap for mankind, when he got to walk on the moon. And ladies, very famous female individual, the first American female astronaut, was named Sally Ride, and she actually got to pilot some of the first space shuttle missions. Alright, so that's the information for space exploration. There's another set of notes for this section that we'll get to at another time, and it is another set of PowerPoints.